Chapter 19. It was a long and narrow road. Past the woods, where the crags met the mountains, a tunnel dove into the rock. Angharad was too bone-tired to do more than stumble forward through it. There were lanterns and stairs, the winding of the road taking them back outside, on the side of the mountain, with only a ramshackle wooden railing in the way of the precipitous drop below, before going up in a jagged zigzag. In the distance she saw an island darkened, a realm of monsters and darklings with the stars fixed far above in firmament's crown. The wind moaned plaintively, shaking the railing, and never had she felt more like she'd reached some edge of the world. Was that what it had felt like, for Mother? No, it couldn't be. Angharad felt no wonder, no joy. Only blood drying on her face, the cut on her scalp itching and the smell of the filth and dirt she had squirmed against. Her limbs were made of lead, her head spun around like a weatherman. There had been no discovery here, no horizon reclaimed from the gloam. She had just cut and been cut until she was made to crawl through shame and corpses. She had won in honor, as close as her saber had been able to reach to that, but now it felt like such a passing thing. Angharad forced herself up the stairs, their hypnotic back and forth of angles going up the mountainside, but time slipped through her fingers like sand. How long had she been walking? Every lantern, every step felt the same, and there was no sign of the promised sanctuary. Had song not promised to wait for her? Yet here she stood alone. Angharad licked dry lips, but all it did was salt the bloody cracks. One more step, she told herself. Always one more step, until she reached the yellow lanterns and their promise of safety. She slipped, landing on her knees, but was too exhausted to let out more than a moan of pain. The wind echoed her, mocking. She turned to chide it, to let out something of the scream still stuck in her throat, but her vision swam. She felt her knees give and there was a burst of pain, then nothing. Warmth and cool. A blanket above, but beneath her was stone digging at her back. Dash should be fine, she hasn't lost so much blood she would die from it. Eyes fluttering open, Angharad let out a hiss of pain at the bright burn of the lanterns. She shaded her vision with her hand, finding her hand slow, as if she'd just gone through a great exertion. In many ways, she had. Ah, a voice she recognized said. "Back with us, Lady Tredegar." Grey eyes looked down at her, the apprentice physician, if he was truly that, Tristan meeting her gaze as he wiped his hands with a dirty rag. He had, she noticed, a swollen black eye. Angharad tried, but found her mouth felt full of cotton. She swallowed, which helped a little. "Where are we?" She got out. "On the stairs to Sanctuary," Tristan informed her. "Where you fell unconscious. I had a look at you, however, and there is nothing to worry about. That cut on your head could do with stitches, but your wounds are rather minor." He paused. "I assume your state comes from lack of sleep or contract overuse," the Sacramentan said. "Either way, given some rest you should be back on your feet after a day or two." "I do not have a day or two," she thought. The longer she gave Augusto Cherden, the better the chances he would somehow wriggle a way out of this. And what if he tried to call their duel while she was unfit to fight? None of this, though, was Tristan's concern. "Thank you," Angharad croaked. "For the help." "Thank young," Tristan shrugged. "It's his herbero I use to disinfect your wounds and wash your face. It's the cheap stuff from Estabra district, so it's halfway to grain alcohol." The Perduri sniffed at the air, brow-nodding. Was that peppermint she smelled? "Foul stuff," Tristan sympathized. "But I'd recommend a swallow or two from the flask to get you fit to walk anyway." Angharad was beginning to reconsider her assumption that he was a physician. Or at least a proper one. He might have been like one of those shipboard doctors she'd heard about, whose only two remedies were maize beer and rum. Smiling, the man withdrew and was replaced by a familiar face, Lady Ferranda Vilazar, looking ragged and red-eyed. The noblewoman offered her a hand. "Up, Lady Angharad," Ferranda said. "The faster we reach Sanctuary, the faster we can rest." She took the hand but wriggled around to keep the blanket on her, adjusting it over her shoulders after Ferranda hoisted her up. Though clothed, she felt cold. Her vision swam for a moment, but a long breath later she was fine. enough so that she could take in the sight of the people gathered further down the stairs. A ragged pair of middle age were the furthest down, the man of the pair holding up an old woman with a mangled leg on his back. Above them an old man leaned against the wall, and then there were a few she knew by name: Lan, the remaining twin with blue lips, and Young, the soldier who she must thank for the use of his drink. There was no sign of Sonali, an absence that had her heart squeezing in sympathy for Firanda, and the last then should be. Angharad froze, then began reaching for a saber she no longer had. A hollow, they had a hollow among them. Had they made a pact with the cultists like Tupac? Half the others immediately pointed weapons at her. She is not a darkling, Young said, tone even. She couldn't speak for herself, sorry, for it could only be her, firmly told the TNC. I believe your family are seafarers, Lady Tredegar, so you ought to know the name of Triglav. Angharad's shoulders lost some of their tension. The northern colonies, she slowly said. You are of the peoples below the broken gates. Not so broken, before your people came, Saray coldly replied. Like many other things. Angharad coughed into her hand, embarrassed. In truth she knew little of the Triglav, for her mother's travels had been to the east and not the north, but she did know a few things. For one, Triglav was the name for the endless petty chiefdoms of that land as well as the people themselves. Unlike the people of Malin, they had never grown past their tribal roots. I apologize for the discourtesy, Angharad awkwardly said. I assure you, not all of the Isles believe slavery without evil. Splendid news, Saray replied with a politely savage smile. Why, near half the Malani I've ever met have assured me the same. No doubt the slave trade will be ending any day now. There was a long, barren stretch of silence. Then Tristan snorted out a laugh, which was shoddily turned into a cough. I've just seen to her wounds, Saray, don't murder her right afterwards, he said. It's very inconsiderate of my time. Time we are wasting, Lady Firanda mildly said. Shall we get moving instead of chattering like magpies? Fucking finally, the middle-aged man below bit out. How light do you think she is? He gestured at the old woman on his back, who Angharad only now noticed had a bandage-covered eye under broken spectacles. Phyllis, the woman by him chided. I have been eating a lot of croquettes, the old woman admitted. Amusement spread, the earlier unpleasantness thinning. Tristan and Saray took the lead. She only now noticed that the Sacramontan was limping, and one of his boots was wrapped with bandages, to begin the climb. Angharad was tugged forward by Lady Firanda. The other woman leaned close. Stay on Saray's good side, she murmured. She's joined to the hip with Tristan, and he was Young's favorite even before we all came to owe him. Angharad slowly nodded. She then hesitated, not sure whether she should ask. Firanda noticed and her face tightened. Sonali was caught by the air venton, she curtly said. We nearly all died to it as well. My condolences, the dark-skinned noblewoman said. A platitude, but she meant every word. Retainers that had been with you for long were as family, and Lady Firanda was obviously taking his loss hard. Firanda nodded, a tad shortly. What happened for you to end up alone and unconscious on the stairs? She asked. I thought you were to stay with the others. Augusto Cherdan murdered his valet to flee from Lupines faster, Angharad flatly said. Naturally, I challenged him to an honor duel. Firanda's eyes widened. Naturally, she repeated, though her voice was a little strange. As a consequence, when we later encountered an ambush by Tupac Sickle and the cult of the Red Eye, he betrayed us in an attempt to rid himself of me while running away, she continued. In doing so, he also threw away the lives of Isabel, Master Cosme and his own brother. Their conversation was interrupted by Tristan butting in, abandoning Saray at the front as he slowed to stay just ahead of them. All these were caught by the cultists? He asked, sounding surprised. Though Angharad was miffed at both the presumption he could force his way into the conversation and the tacit admission he had been eavesdropping, she bit down on a sharp reply. She owed a debt for his treatment. No, she replied. As far as I know, only Brasida, one of Lady Isabel's handmaids, was captured. I fought to slow down the enemy before shaking them off, but took some wounds in doing so. The others fled ahead and I lost blood. You then found me in the stairs. It was not reasonable, Angharad reminded herself, to feel abandoned by this. She had good as ordered them to leave her behind. And yet, don't be childish, she ordered herself. Both Tristan and Ferranda looked skeptical at the implication of her minor wounds having undone her so, but as both deduced the fuller truth had to do with the contract, neither pressed the matter. You are not the only one who fought Tupac and his men, Lady Ferranda told her. Lady Inyani lost one of her own to him as well. It was sad news, but not without a silver lining. She would not be short on allies when she urged for them to string up the traitor and his brood. He betrayed one of his own subordinates, Angharad said with open disgust. He sold out Leander Galatas to the Hollows when they complained too few had been delivered into their hands. Tristan's brow knotted at the news. Had he been friends with the man? He is burning too many bridges, the scruffy Sacramontan said. He must still have something up his sleeve to think he'd get away with it. Then let us end him before that, Angharad said. He should be made to stand before a tribunal of the rest of us the moment he steps out of sanctuary, do you not agree? The reactions were the opposite of what she had expected. Tristan's face displayed some enthusiasm at the notion while Ferranda's closed. She had thought the Infanzona bolder than this, and the man more cowardly. Why else would he have only browbeaten those weaker than him? It may not be that easy, Lady Ferranda said. The trial of ruins may well force our hand otherwise. I look forward to working with you in the second trial, Lady Tredegar. The pale-eyed traitor had smiled down at her. Angharad's belly clenched in rage. Had he done it all knowing he would be able to wriggle his way out of consequences? How? She asked. How was he to trick his way out, and how could she make him choke on his trickery instead? That is a conversation that can wait until we reach sanctuary, Ferranda firmly replied. The next step can wait until this one is taken. Angharad grimaced but did not contradict her. Tristan returned to the fore, and after the perduree saw the look of grief Ferranda's face when she asked about how their company had crossed the river, she let the matter drop. Instead she inquired as to what still lay between them and the Yellow Lanterns, a change of subject the Infanzona eagerly seized upon. It turned out, embarrassingly enough, that Angharad had collapsed less than an hour away from the end of the trial. They went up the jagged stairs, then into another tunnel of bare stone that headed deep into the mountain. The supports keeping the ceiling from collapse were made of wood or iron, but unlike the earlier railing they were in a fine state. The watch kept them in good order. The maze is within a cavern, then? Angharad asked. It is that in the same way that Vesper is a cavern, Ferranda said. You will see. Before long, Angharad did. The tunnel ended abruptly into a precipitous flight of carved stairs, but she hardly spared a look for those. Blowing wind threatened to put out their lanterns, but there was no need of those to see. From the ceiling of the gargantuan underground chamber hung great pieces of gold giving out a ghostly glow, slowly moving as if the world's greatest crib mobile. Below it, and then was spread out the trial of ruins in all its glory. First the fort surrounded by yellow lanterns, dilapidated bastions guarding over a massive iron gate set in pillar of stone that rose all the way to the ceiling. But it was what lay beyond that had her breath catching in her throat, a city of broken shrines. It was as if some mad spirit had stolen 1,000 ancient temples and mausoleums and tossed them into a haphazard pile that filled the entire chamber, making a mountain maze of the lost and sacred. Angharad could see no path above, no more than if she were trying to climb a mountain within the mountain. They would have to go through the labyrinth to get on the other end of the chamber, not around it. Behind her there were gasps, and she was almost stumbled into, the toothless old man gazing at the sight with open wonder. He looked the most alive she had seen of him yet. It is true, then, Francio breathed out. Shrines from islands halfway across the Tribbean Sea, all drawn here by some god's hand. This place is known? Angharad asked. In some circles, the old man evaded. It has long been said the watch locks away on the Dominion gods that are too dangerous to let loose, but the rumor is dubious in provenance. The old man sucked at his gums thoughtfully. Angharade was polite enough not to wrinkle her nose in distaste. "The scope of this does seem beyond even them," Francho said. Angharade could only agree, for there must be hundreds and hundreds of ruins here. How could any assembly of men bring these inside a hollow mountain through those narrow stairs they had earlier climbed? It would not do to block the way, so the Perdiri began her way down the stone stairs. They were mercifully dry, but the slope steep and utterly without railing. Angharade took care in climbing down, until finally she reached flat and solid ground. She waited there with the vanguard until the rest of the company caught up, eyes peeled on the even stretch of stone ahead of them leading straight to the old fort encircled by yellow lanterns. Sanctuary. They proceeded only after everyone had gathered, the mood growing buoyant with safety just in sight. The fort was a sprawling thing, shaped as a square of tall walls with pointed bastions peeking out of the corners. It was also half a ruin. Parts of the walls collapsed and only 2 of the bastions still whole. There were lanterns on the ramparts beyond the yellow ones outside, and in their glow the silhouettes of black-cloaked men armed with muskets could be seen. The gate was a collapsed wall, guarded by a pair of bored watchmen who betrayed little interest when their company came in sight. One of the 2, a tall woman of Sacramontan look, counted them out loud. 10, huh? She mused. Maybe it'll not be a complete loss this year. With the others inside, you should have the numbers for the maze. The other watchman laughed at her words. Head in, he told them. You are now formally under sanctuary after having completed the trial of lines. Congratulations. A pause. There's warm food and supplies ahead. No amount of rudeness could have prevented a swelling of joy after being told that. If you want to withdraw under our protection, the watchman said, find Lieutenant Wen. Thank you, Yang replied. After a polite nod, the Tiangxi was the first to take the slender gate, the rest lining up to follow behind him. Angharade was 5th in line and went with a spring to her step. She was eager to see how her companions had fared without her. Yet as she made to enter the fort, the watchwoman of the pair stopped her, laid a hand on her arm. Angharade frowned at her for the presumption. Angharade Trediger? The tall Sacramontan asked. Correct, she coolly replied. The watchwoman's expression brightened. Good, we were getting afraid you wouldn't make it, she said. There's going to be an unreasonably pretty Milani by the cooking pots, Sergeant Mendissa. You're to go to her. Angharade blinked. May I ask why? Because we all like brandy, the other woman dryly replied. Go on, then. Mystified at the nonsense reply, Angharade obeyed and caught up to Frankie as he entered a great courtyard. It was, she saw, the beating heart of this ruined fort. A wide open space of cracked paving stones led up to the rampart at the back and the massive iron gate set into it. Most everyone seemed to have made a home there, including the watch. The blast cloaks had claimed an old barracks on the left side, its windows barred and stripes of dark paint marking it as off-limits. Besides them, stairs went up to one of the still standing bastions, atop which great lanterns hung and someone appeared to have set up astronomical equipment. On the opposite side of the courtyard, the watch had built out of old stables a series of small rooms, stalls with planks for roof and curtains hung as doors. It would be a thin illusion of privacy, but still more than Angharade had been graced with in weeks, months, even, moving between ships and inns since leaving the Isles. Further back stood what looked like a cross between a lumber yard and smithy, used only by a thick watchman chopping wood, but what drew Angharade's eye was not at the sides of the courtyard but the very heart. Tables were set in a loose circle around the makeshift kitchen, with a shoddy brick oven and cooking hearth. And rising from one of the tables to the right, abandoning steaming bowls of stew, were the companions she had parted ways with. Angharade. Isabel called out, running forward. The dark-haired beauty shot past Tristan and Sare, barely slowing as she half leapt into Angharade's arms. As surprised as she was delighted, she caught the Infanzona by the waist and held her up to avoid the both of them being bowled over. Isabel laughed as she was spun and sat down, grinning all the while. I knew you'd make it, she said. I just knew. It was a close-run thing, Angharade admitted. Had I not been found by our friends here, I might have died on the stairs. Then I must thank them most earnestly, Isabel said. She got on the tip of her toes to peek over Angerade's shoulder, beaming at those standing there, now most of the crew she had arrived with, and noticeably not moving out of being held by the waist. Noticeably to Angerade, anyway. She reluctantly extricated herself from Isabel only to be crowded by the others. Master Cosme shook her hand, complimenting her on a daring escape, and even Raymond spared the sneer to tell her he was glad she was still with them. Brun contained himself to a nod, but he was smiling, and Sung went around inspecting her and saying, "You looked like you've crawled through dirt," the Tianxi complained. "I did," Angerade flatly replied. "I'll let you take my place in the line for use of the washtub, then," Song told her. It would be criminal to do otherwise. Recognizing that for the affection it was, Angerade let go of the sliver of irritation that had been rising. Song was, if perhaps not yet a friend, then at least a good companion. She was not to be begrudged a bit of fussing. Her gaze strayed, for she had yet to see Beatrice, and she found the other survivors from the Bluebell arrayed around the tables. Some had risen to greet people she had come with, but others simply looked on with interest. Tupac and his surviving traders, Akanthi Foes and O'Cotlin, sat away from the others. As did Augusto Cherton, who rose to his feet face with an ashen face once she found his eyes. All right, a voice cheerfully called out. "Enough of that, my lambkins. We are no longer feeding the fire under the pot, so that stew is only going to get colder." Angerade wrenched her gaze away from Augusto to the new speaker, finding a woman who must be Sergeant Mendisa. The sergeant's green eyes were set in high cheek face with lustrous dark skin, standing even taller than Angerade, who was taller than most. Neither her black cloak nor the uniform beneath managed to hide the voluptuousness of her curves, which seemed most irrepressible. Unreasonably pretty indeed. Angerade would have expected to see such a beauty at court, not in the depths of this cursed island. "Sergeant Mendisa?" she asked. "I am," she easily replied. "Why do you ask?" "I was told by the watchwoman at the gate that..." She was interrupted by a man passing her by and brusquely setting a wooden chest on the nearest table, the slamming sound making those closest start in surprise. He then set down a bottle of green grass by the chest and glanced at Sergeant Mendisa. She straightened, then slammed her palm against the table. "Silence," she shouted. Silence for the officer. Given her previous air of cheer, the sudden turn had them all settling down within moments. The noblewoman's eyes moved to the man who must be the officer in question and was taking them all in silently. He was a big man, Tianxi in looks and nearly of a height with Angerade, but with a massive belly barely tucked into his black coat and gilet, distending the fabric over waist-high trousers. Many watchmen bore crisscrossing bandoliers, but he wore his as straps instead. He should have looked comical, a fat man in a tight uniform, but the confidence in the way he held himself smothered that notion in the crimp. The officer went fishing through his coat, taking out a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles that he carefully unfolded and put on. His gaze swept through them, more than a few straightening their backs. "My name is Lieutenant Wen," he said. "I share command of the old fort's garrison with Lieutenant Vicente, who if you were very lucky you might once see in passing. She's not particularly interested in people when there's fleshy bits left on the bones." He smiled, though there was little friendliness to it. "Most of you will have met Sergeant Mendisa," Lieutenant Wen said, gesturing to the woman at his side. "Remember her face, for she has been charged with seeing to your needs and deciding if any of you need to be shot for breaking our very, very simple rules." Sergeant Mendisa, still incongruously pretty in her own black cloak and coat, waved at them with a smile so charming it should make flowers bloom. The Tianxi lieutenant raised 3 fingers, then slowly folded one. "1. Stay out of left side of the fort. That is to say the barracks, the bastion and the supply depot," Lieutenant Wen said. "If you do not, you will be immediately shot," Sergeant Mendisa cheerfully finished, branding her fingers like a pistol and shooting it at Tupac. The Aslan had the gall to wink back. 2, Lieutenant Wen continued, folding a second finger, "Should any of you contract with a god within the ruins, you must immediately report having done so upon returning to Sanctuary. If you do not, "Shut," Sergeant Mendissa helpfully provided, smacking her fist into her palm. Had they practiced this, Angharade wondered? They must have. "And 3, the fat lieutenant said, taking his hand away, "there is to be no killing of each other within the bounds of the Yellow Lanterns. As a particular extension of this, should any of you choose to retire from the trials and come under the Watch's protection, any attempted violence against them will be met with as slow and inventive a death as we can figure out." He smiled again, even less friendly. "We've got a tinker from the Amuthi Society around, and it does get dreadfully boring out here," Lieutenant Wen said. "So you can bet it'll be a spectacle." The Blastcloak then clapped his hands, startling a few of the faint-hearted among their company, and slid his thumbs into his belt. "Simple rules, as I said, but let it not be said I am not an accommodating man," Lieutenant Wen said. "Are there any questions?" Angharade cleared her throat, unsure whether or not she should raise her hand. The Tianxi turned an amused eye on her, as if able to read her thoughts. "And you are?" he asked. "Lady Angharade Tredegar," she replied. "Ah," the lieutenant said, tone turning gregarious, "Captain Ocean's niece. Good, good. I put 10 arboles on your reaching the trial of weeds, so do try not to die." "I will do my best," Angharade hesitantly answered. The man chuckled. "Go on, girl." Rallying, the Perduri cleared her throat again. "Am I to understand that the Watch does not care if a killing takes place beyond the lines of sanctuary?" she asked. "You're free to butcher each other all you like out there in the maze," Lieutenant Wen agreed. "I wouldn't recommend it, given how it works, but we're not here to hold your hand." The Tianxi was only half paying attention by the end of the sentence, popping open the box on the table and riffling within. He produced the cigar, which he brought close and smelled with obvious relish. Angharade hit her distaste. Mother had enjoyed these as well, but she shared her father's opinion that the smell was simply foul. Someone else cleared their throat. Lord Ice Han, the chubby-cheeked man from the Imperial Someshware. He looked pale, and his hair sweaty. Neither he nor his companion Shalini had been sitting at the same table as Lady Inyani and her nephew, even though they had come together. "How does the maze work?" he asked. "We have yet to be told. We sent out a detachment when the first of you arrived to check which passages are open this year," Lieutenant Wen replied. "They'll be back sometime during the night, barring disaster. You will all be summoned to an assembly come morning so the practicalities of the trial might be explained." Tupac Sickle stepped forward then, drawing many eyes, and few of them friendly. "Are we allowed to begin the trial early if we wish?" the Aztlan asked. Lieutenant Wen laughed. "There's a cliff around here you can jump down from instead," he said. "That'll at least save us having to retrieve your corpse. But sure, easily, you can start early." He pointed past the walls, to another hole in the rampart. "Head that way, the Lion Shrine opens almost every year," Lieutenant Wen said. "And shout for help when you get caught, would you?" He beamed at the Aztlan, the cheer having a vicious tinge to it. "We won't be coming, but it'll draw other gods, so you might die quicker." Angharade was beginning to suspect there might be a reason Lieutenant Wen had been assigned to garrison duty under a mountain on a largely inhabited island in the middle of nowhere. "Thank you," Tupac replied, looking entirely unperturbed. Angharade was learning to hate how nothing shook him. Her hand was itching for a blade to hold. "Any other questions?" the lieutenant asked. There were not, so he reminded them they could ask Sergeant Mendissa for supplies and invited them to rest until tomorrow, or had begun the last part, at least, when Angharade moved. The questions were finished, so courtesy had been observed. She brushed past the confused Shalini and a grinning Lan, ignored Ocotlan as he raised his fists in a fighting stance, and then Augusto Cherton was facing her. Not a scratch on the man, save for his broken arm now in a sling. He sneered, opening his mouth, and Angharade socked him in the stomach. He folded, letting out a wheeze of pain, and there was a ripple in the crowd as people made room for them. Angharade sought out Raymond Cherton in the crowd and caught his gaze, giving him a slight nod. After a heartbeat of hesitation he returned it. As for Master Cosm, who stood by the younger brother's side, his face was conflicted. She would have to trust that Raymond's orders and the earlier betrayal tipped the balance of loyalties the correct way. She chose not to look for Isabel. As I did not strike you in the face, you may choose to consider yourself as not having been challenged to a duel, Angarate told Augusto. She would not turn down an opportunity to strike him a third time. You bitch, the Infantson hissed. Augusto Cherton, for the betrayal of myself and 3 others to cultists of the Red Eye I call you to answer blade in hand, Angarate implacably replied. She had given her word to Cosmo Flora that she would not pursue her challenge of Augusto until the end of the second trial, but she was following those words exact. Let the fisher say what he would, Angarate would not bend her neck to the ways of the world. She could survive without carving away at her own principles, and if there were prices to pay for that, so be it. You don't even have a sword, Augusto protested, taking a step back. There was a snort from behind them. She may have mine, Sung said. The Infantson's eyes dilated with fear as he swept the crowd and found no support there. The Cherton brothers had made few friends and Augusto burned bridges with even those. He reached for his sword, giving Angarate an excuse to dart forward and hit him in the belly again, catching his wrist and slamming the blade back in the sheath. She caught him by the collar and began dragging him towards the entrance to the old fort. The flat grounds there were not within the span of the yellow lanterns, and so not sanctuary. Augusto struggled, but his broken arm was in the way and she was stronger than her. Watchman! Augusto shouted. This is murder, she breaks the spirit of the rules, you must intervene. Angarate paused there, for if the watch intervened she would have to give way. Lieutenant Wen, still standing by the table, took a look at them and scratched a match on the table atop. He pressed it against his cigar, pulling at it until the end burned cherry red. The Tianxi then breathed out a stream of smoke, cocking an eyebrow over his spectacles. I'm not seeing anything, the watchman said. Are you seeing anything, Sergeant? Sergeant Mendisa, pulling off the cork on the bottle the lieutenant had earlier brought, began pouring herself a cup of the amber liquid within the green glass. Not a one, sir, she prettily smiled. And I'm trying real hard. Lieutenant Wen rested his hands on his bulging belly, offering a wide friendly smile while beaming at them both. To give Captain Ocean our regards when you next see him, Lady Angarate, the Tianxi mused. The brandy and cigars have made garrison duty much more tolerable. Sergeant Mendisa raised a silent toast to his words. Angarate was split between horror and gratitude. Her uncle's doing was freeing her to deal out justice, but he had also quite obviously bribed these people. Even back on the Blue Belt, he'd had a friend watching out for her in the crew. How many strings had Uncle Ocean pulled, and how many of them were crooked? When it sunk in that no help was coming, Augusto let out a noise that was whimper trying to be a scream. How dare you, he babbled as Angarate dragged him forward. House Cherton will. He tried to get his blade out again, so she twisted his broken arm and forced the steel back into its sheath while he screamed. They will haunt you like an animal, Augusto hissed, to the ends of the mere feet of the break in the rampart now. She could already see the yellow glow of the lanterns outside. The entrance to the fort was well lit, lanterns hanging from the ramparts, so there was no missing it when the shadow caught up to her. Cutting across the floor it slithered, warning her of the arrival before Tupac Sickle ever came to stand before her. Between Angarate and the way out, Augusto began struggling again, so she stomped down on his foot. What is this, Sickle? She coldly asked. I am, the Aztlan grinned, defending the weak. The sheer absurdity of what he'd just said gave her pause. Enough that Augusto was able to wriggle out of her grasp, and though she kicked him down to his hands and knees she saw Tupac hefting his segmented spear and she was yet unarmed. She was not, however, alone. Behind her a pistol was cocked as Song came to stand at her left, and to her right Brun pressed something into her hand, a straight sword, Song's own. The Sacramontan held his hatchet, and tough he smiled reassuringly. His eyes were cold. Angarate's fingers closed around the blade, weighing it. It was a little lighter than she'd like, but it would do. Move, Angarate Tredegar told her enemy, or be moved. Augusto crawled towards his protector and she let him, for it would not matter. From the corner of her eye, The Perduri saw that O'Cutlan was moving to flank them. The crowd looked reluctant to intervene, but the escalation was losing her support. No one wanted a full-on skirmish. "Alas, I think we will have to save that dance for another day," Tupac wistfully told her. A heartbeat later there was a sharp crack and stone went flying as a shot was fired on the ground between them. Above them, on all sides, blast cloaks were pointing their muskets. Lieutenant Wen, looking irritated, strode past her and pivoted to turn a glare on everyone. Sergeant Mandisa followed him, leveling their way the largest blunderbuss Angharad had ever seen. It was already cocked and the Milani looked a little too eager to use it for comfort. "Enough," he ordered. "Weapons down, all of you, or I'll have you strung up." Angharad gritted her teeth even as Tupac made a show of dismantling his spear, pale eyes smiling at her all the while. Brun's hatchet came down, though, and Song's muzzle dipped. "It's over, Angharad," the Silverite Tianxi sighed. "They get away with it for now." Lieutenant Wen stared her down until she lowered her sword, then nodded in satisfaction. She watched Augusto offering groveling thanks to his savior with disgust. Walking away, the bespectacled lieutenant stopped to clap her shoulder and lean in. His sergeant was but a step behind. "Sorry, Tredegar, but Xickle's not just Jiwu trash come here for bragging rights," he told her. "He's to become one of us, like you, so it's out of my hands. We can only play favorites so much." He left her standing there, rooted to the ground and facing the Milani sergeant's cheerful face. "Don't lose heart, Lambkin," Sergeant Mandisa comforted her. "It's really easy to murder people in the maze, so you'll still have plenty of chances." Angharad wondered what it said about her that the perky-made woman's words did, in fact, cheered her up a bit. Chapter 20 The consolation prizes for being denied her duel were several. Sergeant Mandisa sent a watch surgeon to stitch the cut on her head and she sat down for a hot meal afterwards. Little more than stew and bread, but both were warm and after days on the run she would have been delighted by even a warm rock. She polished both off and Sergeant Mandisa even offered her a thimble of brandy, which she had not anyone else, before clapping her shoulder. "There's a few swords in the armory," she said. "Have a look when you're done." A pause as the beautiful sergeant looked her up and down. "Wen said I should remind you there's clothes as well, if you want something to take something, but that shirt and coat look you went with is pretty ravishing," Sergeant Mandisa praised. Angharad went still as a statue, thimble in hand. "It is shockingly fashionable," Isabel agreed, eyes smiling. "I could see it taking in salons with the right adjustments, perhaps a silk sash around the waist or an open vest." "Colored breast bindings," the Milani sergeant suggested. "That way you can make them out through the shirt." "Scandalous," Isabel appreciatively said. Angharad hunched over and drank her thimble of brandy, as sadly it was impossible for her to disappear down it from sheer mortification. Perhaps a vest was in order, if the watch kept any. Her coat needed mending again anyhow. Sergeant Mandisa strolled away after clapping her on the back again, leaving her to embarrassment. "There's a well for drinking water and another for the washtub," Brun informed her, perhaps taking pity. "I'll show you her so you can clean up." "That would be a fine thing," Angharad admitted. Tristan had done good work getting rid of the blood, but he had not been interested in the filth beyond what might get into her wounds. She was surprised Isabel could stomach to sit across from her given how she must smell. "I have the first place in line after the watch is done using it," Song told her. "As I said before our interlude, you can have it." "That is kind of you," Angharad said, nodding her thanks. "At the least we owe," the Tianxi meaningfully said. Her gaze turned to the end of the table, distracting Angharad from reminding her she owed nothing at all. Song had saved her life on the Bluebell. The silver-eyed woman was staring at the two sitting near the edge, Master Kozman Rem and Cherden. Both were keeping silent, looking uncomfortable. Now that the heat of the moment had passed, both were wrestling with the reality that they had surrendered Augusto Cherden to her blade. It was Cosmo Flora who broke first, shaking his head. "It is as she said," he admitted. "And you kept your word to the letter. It's another duel you tried to fight." There was a coolness to the way he beheld her now, a wariness. Had he guessed using the precise wording was her intention all along? "Rem and Cherden," on the other hand, looked more tired and angry than anything else. "Would that you were able to end him," he said. "Cosm would not hear of my seeing to it myself, I have explicit orders otherwise," the soldier flatly said. "Else he would not have reached sanctuary alive," Raymond continued, teeth gritted. "He tried to murder us with that shot, to murder me. I would have struck him down if Song had not stopped me," Brun admitted. "Before we all ran, I mean. The last thing we needed was to start fighting each other," Song flatly replied. "All it would accomplish was help the cultists." Cosm nodded at her gratefully, then hesitated when looking Angerade's way. "Augusto Sheridan is no longer under my protection," he finally told her. "I ensured he reached sanctuary and had the opportunity to withdraw from the trials. I owe nothing more." "He will stay, then?" Angerade said, honestly surprised. Raymond laughed unkindly. "He must," the younger Sheridan said. "He will be disgraced when Isabel and I return to Sacramonte, perhaps even cast out of our house. Unless Lord Sheridan seeks a feud with House Ruesta, he will most certainly be cast out," Isabel coldly stated. "You believe he will try to kill you," Angerade slowly said. "To prevent word getting back." "Not prevent, that would be too difficult. But it is understood between the houses that deaths on the Dominion are to be left on the Dominion," Isabel explained. "Conflict has occurred before, you understand. He would be stretching the bounds of tolerance, of course, but if he returns and we do not." "Any is better than none," Raymond said, face pulled tight. "Our father is not a sentimental man." Angerade glanced at Cosm, who seemed to be treating this as none of his affair. He avoided her gaze, which was confirmation enough. The Perduri hit her disgust at the thought that a kinslayer might be welcomed back into one's family after the deed. It was absurd that Sacramonte might call itself a civilized nation without answering such a foul crime by throwing the kinslayer down a cliff. "But such talk can wait until tomorrow," Isabel said. "Shall I ask Beatrice to mend your coat again?" Her smile as she said that was sly, a joke between only the two of them. Angerade was uncomfortable sharing in it before Raymond Sheridan, however, who still seemed to be expecting these trials to end in a marriage. "Please," Angerade said, casting a look around. Where was Beatrice, anyhow? She had seen neither hide nor hair of Isabel's sole remaining handmaid since she reached sanctuary. "She is resting," Isabel said, answering an unspoken question. Song scoffed. "She is catatonic," the silver-eyed woman harshly corrected. "She came close to dying too many times for her nerves to keep hauling and should not be on this island to begin with." Song matched Isabel's cold look with one of her own. Angerade went still in surprise, for never before had the Tianxi been this bellicose with one of the Infanzones, not even Augusto after he murdered Gascon. More surprising still, she gave no sign of backing down even in the face of Isabel's open displeasure. "We are all tired," Angerade said. "And my coat can certainly wait." She rose to her feet, almost hastily. "There was talk of a washtub, I believe?" The two tore their gazes away from each other. Her request snuffed out the fuse for now, Song and Brun rising to help her as they had promised, but a line had clearly been drawn in her absence. The washtub was little more than a barrel with a fire underneath, large enough for her to fit her body up to her neck in the water. The water was hot and it felt like being born anew to wash away all the filth and blood. She almost fell asleep inside and did not last long after getting out. The watch had set out bedrolls in the small chambers made from the stables, so she simply claimed the one by Songs and closed the curtain before crawling under the covers. She was out in moments. Angerade woke early, among the first to do so, and shambled out of her bedroll for a meal. Only a few had preceded her, among them Lady Acanthe and the Tianxi veteran called Young. The two avoided each other and herself, and as the watchman charged with distributing the morning porridge, a horrid slop that tasted vaguely salty, did not feel like conversation either. She ate in silence. By the time she was halfway through, Song joined her, the two of them soon commiserating together about the fair. Conversation remained light. "Your braids are coming undone," Song told her. She had suspected as much but could not be sure without a mirror. "And the hair is gone dry," Angerade sighed. The rainwater did more damage than the bath, I think. At least her stitches did not sting even when she smiled. I cannot do anything for that, but I could help you with the braids, Sung offered. I used to do my little sister's. Angharade started in surprise. You have siblings? She asked. I am the third of 5, the silver-eyed woman smiled. My parents were very orderly, 2 boys, then 3 girls. I am an only child myself, Angharade shared. I had some cousins from my mother's younger brother, but I believe them to be dead. Uncle Arwell and his 2 boys had been in the manor when it was set aflame. None had come out. Your uncle and the watch? No, Uncle Ocean is the elder of a pair, Angharade said. My mother had 2 younger brothers. Unlike father, who like her had been without siblings. She had never met her grandparents on that side of the family either, both having passed years before her birth. Talk of their families cast a pall on the conversation, so Angharade accepted the offer of help with her braids to tack on a different wind. Song took a bench in the perduri set before her, finding it soothingly pleasant for someone to play with her hair. Both their moods improved and they sat there as the rest of the fort began to wake around them. Ishan still looking sickly, Song murmured. Angharade's eyes found the chubby-cheeked Someshwari in question, who like many among them was looking down at his bowl with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. He did look young, she thought, and his elegant saffron tunic was touched with old sweat. It is not a good time to fall sick, Angharade said. I do not believe he is, at least not in that sense, Song told her. Inyani's company arrived an entire day before the rest of us, but they ran into the Heliodorn beast on the way. One of them used a contract on it to get away, and now Ishan Nair looked sickly even though he had a day more to rest than the rest of us. It was, she would admit, a detail of significance. They spoke no more of it, however, for something else caught their eye. The old woman Angharade had journeyed with for a few hours, Vanessa, was being helped into a seat by Tristan. He then went to fetch them both porridge. Words is that the watch physician advised they amputate the leg, Song said. She refused, but they won't keep her on pain drafts forever, those are expensive, and if she cannot do the trial, what do they care? Did you learn how she was wounded? Angharade asked. It does not seem like Sickle's work or a Darkling's. She had not wanted to hurt Faranda yesterday by prodding the fresh wound of Sonali's death, but surely others of that group must have talked. Song chuckled. It's a story worth hearing, and they have not been shy in sharing it. Angharade listened intently at the tale, with every word more amazed than any of them had lived at all. No doubt the events had been exaggerated, but to use an outwitted monster as a bridge was too livid a tale to have been entirely invented. Tristan did this? She asked. Ansare, Song reminded her. Signs are an art of great power. That much Angharade would not dispute, but she had a hard time believing that the same man who had beaten a nigh helpless woman for a pistol that had caught his fancy would take such risks for others. Song was nearly done with her braids by the time everyone was awake, and as the conversation ebbed low the noblewoman considered her way forward. Tupac Sickle must be made to pay for his actions, though not through some squalid murder as the sergeant had implied. A trial ought to take place, with crimes laid out and witnesses swearing oaths. He had made enough enemies that Angharade liked her odds. The only questions was who she should approach first. Lady Inyani or her musings were cut short by a sunny Sergeant Mandissa walking out of the makeshift kitchen with a large copper pot, mercilessly beating it with a wooden spoon. She had the closest table, your Etsy and Firanda, wincing at the noise. Assemble, assemble, the Milani sergeant called out. An officer requires your attention. Most rose to their feet immediately, a handful inexplicably finishing the rest of their porridge first. But by the time Lieutenant Wen emerged from the barracks even those were standing. The Tianxi already has his gold-rimmed spectacles on and was tearing stripes off what looked like a piece of fresh bread. Once he finished the last, standing in front of everyone, he cleared his throat. The noise did not sound all that apologetic about making everyone wait while he ate. Our scouts are back, Lieutenant Wen announced, so as promised we will now go over the particulars of the second trial. Sergeant Mandissa came to stand by his side, still wielding the fearsome potent spoon. "The trial of ruins is just as simple as the first one was," Lieutenant Wen said. "See how someone mislaid a pile of shrines behind me? It was hard to miss it, given that the vast majority of the great cavern had been swallowed up by the ruins." There was a general murmur of agreement, though no one committed so far as giving a legible answer. Already everyone had grasped that putting your foot forward with the lieutenant was a lot more likely to result in being made a figure of fun than garnering a reward. "There are paths in there," Lieutenant Wen said. "At the end of them lies a gate with a god trapped inside it. Get there, cross the gate, and that's it. That's the entire trial." Someone cleared their throat. "Cosm," Angharade recognized after a moment. "So a maze requiring an offering at the end," the mustachioed soldier stated. "Full of perils, one assumes." The corpulent watchman grinned at the other man, though there was much teeth to it and little amity. "You're an Infanzon dog, a floor. Let's not pretend you didn't read up on everything before setting foot on the ship," Lieutenant Wen said. "It's a little like pretending your virginity mysteriously grew back after you set foot in the brothel." Master Cosm's lips thinned and his mustache trembled with anger, but he held himself back from answering. Sergeant Mandissa cleared her throat. The Tianxi turned to glare at her, but she just cleared it again, louder. Lieutenant Wen sighed. "Fine," he said. "I will be respectful of your delicate maidenhoods and ease you into this adventure with a proper, loving introduction." Angharade wondered whether politely requesting him to abandon that line of metaphor would make things better or worse. Worse, she decided. Almost certainly worse. "Welcome to Trial of Ruins," Lieutenant Wen said with caustic cheer. "We do not know who put those shrines in there and can't be sure why, but we do one thing: they are full of dead and dying gods." "Spirits," he meant. Angharade was uncertain why a dead spirit's existence should matter much. Perhaps traces of power would remain, but surely no more than that. Yet such a creature trapped and dying was certainly to be nothing to trifle with. "Now that may sound like a bad thing," Lieutenant Wen said, allowing a pause. "Because it is," Sergeant Mandissa helpfully provided. "But it's also how you'll get through," the Tianxi said, sliding his thumbs into his belt. "See, our friends out in the ruins can only get so far eating each other, diminishing returns. You know how it goes. Eating people, though? Now that'll stave off extinction a decade or two. So they'll let you into their shrines. So they can eat you," the Milani added, in case anyone had forgot. "Not all shrines will open," Lieutenant Wen warned them. "Some gods are sated, or too close to death, or gone so mad they don't remember how. In practice, that means you'll be navigating a maze to get to the gate at the other end of the cavern." "Seems like a lot of gods to kill," Shalini Gol skeptically said. "Could watchmen even do it?" "We can't," Lieutenant Wen approvingly said. "But not for the reasons you think. If any of you were idiots or blind, you might have missed the giant spinning gold sky." To Angharade's lack of surprise, no one stepped forward to name themselves a blind idiot by admitting that they had. Not that even the most unobservant of men could miss it. The only reason the cavern was not a pitch-black pit broken up only by the occasional lantern was the soft glow given off by the great machine hanging from the ceiling. "We haven't been able to get up there and confirm its antediluvian work, but it seems likely," Lieutenant Wen said. "Which is probably why it's not just a very vain lantern, it's also an ether machine placing restrictions on all gods within its area of influence." Angharade breathed in sharply, and she was not the only one. It was one thing to walk the ruins of the First Empire, the worn and broken works of stone, another to walk in the light of one of their miraculous devices. No one had tamed Vesper the way the antediluvians had, not even Liergan at its height. "We have observed two restrictions," Lieutenant Wen told them. "First, no god can do violence on anything but another god directly. Second, gods are bound to their shrine or seat of power. As a consequence of these, the Watch developed a method. We're going to make you bind your souls to boxes and bet them," Sergeant Mandissa enthusiastically announced. Angharade choked at the words, not quite believing what she'd just heard. She was not the only one. The bespectacled Tianxi glared at his sergeant. "I was building up to that," he reproached. Notably, he did not contradict Sergeant Mendisa. The expression on Lieutenant Wetton's face might have passed for a pout if not for his inborn amount of spite making any application of the word unsuitable. "Fine, the fun's gone now anyway," he sighed. "See, so long as terms are agreed on between mortal and God beforehand, and observed during, the other machine does not consider what follows violence. So everyone has a chance at getting what they want, but God gives you a test, a game with rules, and if you fail or die during they get to eat your soul. If you win they let you through their territory, sometimes even throw in the prize. Only the nice ones do that," Sergeant Mendisa said. "There's not a lot of those left, those that aren't nice tend to eat them. Should we have brought our own soul boxes, or will they be provided?" Shalini sarcastically asked. "You can use ours," Lieutenant Went smiled. "It's nothing all that sinister. Goal, a forged iron lantern splashed with your blood to serve as a mark on your presence in the ether. You're technically gambling the marker, not your soul. It's just so happens the marker's enough for it to get at you." "You use ether seals?" Tupac asked, sounding genuinely surprised. And pleased, for some reason. That did not bode well. "Keep it in your pants, Leopard Society," Lieutenant Wen replied, rolling his eyes. "It's just a temporary mark. We're not exactly burning souls to keep our candles lit, so don't you start looking for a village or two to abduct." "This is vile calumny, Lieutenant," Tupac replied with a friendly smile. "The Leopard Society's purpose is the pursuit of criminals who flee beyond Eastly borders, nothing more." The pair from the Someshwar loudly scoffed and Yang's face might as well have been carved out of stone. Of course, Lieutenant Wen agreed. A second later he gave the Aslan the most exaggerated wink Angharad had ever seen. "And the gate at the end?" Lady Inyani called out. "Nothing else is simple, I will not believe that is." "Simple enough," the bespectacled lieutenant said. "The god at the gate will not open unless 10 or more of what it calls victors, that is to say, those who bet their soul and won, are standing in front of it." Angharad bit the inside of her cheek. And there the nature of the trial changed again, Lieutenant Wen ripping the carpet out from under their feet. There were only 25 of them left, and of these several were no longer fighting fit. The Perduri could not simply bet her soul 10 times and gain victory enough to open the gate on her own, others needed to triumph as well. And if they lose even once, then or afterwards, that is the end of the line. That was why Tupac was so certain he would get away with it. Killing him was good as throwing away a victor. "And he'll kill some of us before we execute him, further slimming our odds." Angharad considered her chances of simply killing him, without trial or verdict, the moment they stepped out of sanctuary. Alone she gave herself better than even odds, but it would not be quick and it meant complications. Ocotlan seemed likely to side with him in a fight, Augusto for certain, and perhaps even a Cainthifos. Angharad was not without allies of her own and Tupac had certainly made enemies enough to be buried, but it would be a skirmish and not a duel. In that chaos, how many would be wounded or slain? The costs would be too high. Even if she gathered enough vengeful souls to strike with her, others would object, more afraid of the deaths ahead than angered by the deaths left behind. The moment Tupac gathered someone to stand with him, showed it would be a fight and not an execution, her support would turn to mist. The trial she had wanted to arrange was good as buried. Angharad breathed in, let the indignation and the surge of rage, he'd been right, the smiling monster, he was going to get away with it, sink deep into her bones and let them simmer there as she calmed the surface of her. Throwing a fit would serve no purpose but making her look unstable, unfit for alliance. Already she had attempted to kill Augusto yesterday. If she now had a tantrum because she would not be allowed to preside over the hanging of another trial-taker, she would look like a bloodthirsty lunatic. For now her reputation was solid and Tupac's was as a full chamber pot, too foul for others to want to get close enough to throw it out, but that did not mean anyone was fond of the smell. She would not set aside the demands of honor, but Angharad was capable of biding her time. She would win oaths and allies, then get the last word. The dead were ever patient and she would not give any less than they. By the time she had fully mastered herself, The conversation had moved on and the bespectacled watchman was speaking again. "You're a lucky bunch," Lieutenant Wen jovially announced. "3 of the first row of shrines are open this year, so you've got plenty of paths to choose from." Lan raised her hand. "Yes," the lieutenant invited. "Is that good?" she asked. "That's good," Lieutenant Wen agreed. "It means dead ends are a lot less likely to force you through a shrine whose test will kill half of you. It's never the ones you expect either," Sergeant Mendism mused. "The Riddler teller is usually such a sweetheart." Angharade made a firm and immediate decision to avoid any shrine whose spirit was named thus. When it became evident Lieutenant Wen would no longer speak unless prompted, the crowd began to disperse. Some of them had known of what was to come, at least part of it, but most would need time to digest the trial laying ahead. It was a man she believed part of the former that made his way towards her as others moved out of the way, making room. Space spread around them, out of either fear or manners. Angharade breathed in, back straight, and faced her enemy. Tupac Sickle had come out of the trial of lines with nary a scuff on him. There was a small rip in the long white skirts going to his ankles, already mended, but his collared green shirt and the dull breastplate he wore over it did not have so much as a stain. Angharade, who had only bathed once in several days and whose braids were not in the proper style, could only envy the way his long hair shone. Even the round earrings hanging from his ear had been freshly polished, flashing copper gold whenever they caught the light. Her gaze must have lingered there, for Tupac flicked one with a finger and gave her a smile. "Like them?" the Eastly asked. "They were a gift from my teacher when I declared my intention to enter the watch." "So you are not a deserter, at least," Angharade coolly replied. The man clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "I was offered help in that endeavor, Angharade Tredegar, not censure," Tupac informed her. "We hold the Rooks in high esteem. They, too, understand the lessons of the fifth loss." It was a concession to manners and not the man that Angharade did not roll her eyes. She was in no mood to indulge the famous Aztlan superstitions, which the Kingdom of Eastli had enshrined as dogma tacked onto the teachings of the Orthodoxy, the myth of some ancient lost war against the sky, ending in defeat and an exile that could only be turned back by triumphing over the Circle Perpetual. That the way to this triumph involved the Kingdom of Eastli invading its neighbors at every opportunity had not endeared the preaching of Eastli priesthood to anyone. "And what would that be, Tupac?" she said. "By the account of your deeds, I would suppose selling us out to cultists." "That the lights are fading," Tupac seriously replied. "That there can be no evil in any act undertaken to keep them on even a breath longer." "What do you think the watch is, Lady Tredegar?" "The Watchmen of Vesper," she replied. "The keepers of the Iscariot Accords." "They are the lid on a very deep well," Tupac Sickle said, shaking his head. "Only when they succeed in that duty can they spare the breath to be anything more." The too perfect Aslan smiled, utterly convinced of his words. Angharade might have spared some pity for him, for the way he must believe this to be able to look at himself in the mirror, were he not one of the vilest men she had ever met. No amount of paper-thin charm would make her forget the scream of terror that had ripped itself out of Brasida's throat. Tiring of this play-acting, of having to offer the monster manners, she sought his gaze and held it. "What do you want?" she bluntly asked. "I will be leading warriors down a path," Tupac said. "Be one of them and I will deliver to you the man whose death you seek." She bared her teeth. "Only one of them," Angharade told him. "Greedy," the Aslan chided, more amused than offended. "But it seems you are not yet ready to bargain." "Nor will I ever be," she replied. After a curt nod she turned her back on him. In the wake of Lieutenant Wen's oration most of the trial takers had dispersed, but there was nowhere to go save the great courtyard. None had gone all that far, beyond the distance courtesy dictated she be given for a private conversation. People clustered in pairs and small group, eyeing their fellows, but before Angharade could consider what she ought to do about this she found Isabel approaching her. The Infanzona offered her soft smile and her arm with it. "Walk with me," Isabel Ruesta asked. Who was Angharade to deny her? There was little to do but go around in circles in the courtyard if they did not want to leave the safety of the fort, so it was that they settled on the second trial, the dark-haired beauty told her, is where most people are said to die. My family knows little about the trial of weeds, save that it ends in a port on the other side of the island, but it does not seem as dangerous. Spirits are never to be trifled with, Angharad agreed. We must make allies, then, else we will be at the mercy of others, Isabel said, then paused. The Infanzona snuck a shy glance. That is, if you still want my company, she said. I would not presume, now that I have no guard left and only a single maid that, of course, Angharad hurried to answer her. You must know I would not abandon you now, Isabel, not when peril has reached its height and you are all but alone. Thank you, Isabel feelingly said. Raymond and Master Cosmo are worthy friends, of course, but I cannot rely on them as I do you. Cosmo has his duty, she conceded. And it was Cherdunlevs he was sworn to protect, not anyone from the house of Ruesta. The four of us, 5, when Beatrice recovers, make a respectable backbone for an expedition, Isabel said. 5 will not be enough, Angharad replied. Not when neither Isabel nor Beatrice were any good at fighting. Then recruitment is in order, the other woman agreed. It would be best, I think, for you to take the lead in this. Angharad cocked an eyebrow. You might not have noticed, but your reputation rose to new heights after your battle with the Red Eye and their traitor allies, Isabel told her. Tupac related how you faced an entire war band by yourself, when he arrived here, and that he believed you would live. The Infanzona squeezed her arm. You will be sought after, Isabel said. Doors that would remain closed to me will open for you. Angharad frowned. Besotted she might be, but she could still see what lay behind what Isabel had said. The star of the Infanzones was fading while her own had risen. On the Blue Bell, Lord Raymond and Isabel would have picked their allies and Angharad been expected to nod. Now the balance had swung the other way, it would be they who nodded, whatever her choices might be. That would take some getting used to. A lifetime of holding the least consequential title in every room had done little to prepare her, for all that father had been readying her for the rule of Linhall. Then I shall see about opening them, Angharad replied with forced cheer. After finishing another round of the courtyard they parted ways, Isabel reminding her that she was always there if Angharad felt the need for advice. By happenstance they had ended near an old acquaintance, which made the first step obvious enough for Angharad. Brun was kneeling by a bench, setting out his supplies and putting order to them. He was also, she saw, keeping a roving eye on the rest of the courtyard while working. He turned to her when she approached, slowly rising to his feet. Lady Angharad, he said, pulling back at his sleeves. Done talking with Ruesta, I see. A touch of embarrassment. It does make my purpose rather obvious, I suppose, Angharad said. A tad, Brun shrugged. She did not make the request and he did not volunteer, which already told her all she needed to know about how the conversation would go if she did. It showed on her face and Brun passed a hand through his blonde locks before grimacing. I would have liked to stick with you, he admitted. But I will not go with Infanzones again, not after what it was like last time. Augusto will not be with us, Angharad said. His lips thinned. And how much did his brother do, when Gascon got a knife in his back? He asked. Did Raymond Cherdun try to help Bracito when she was taken, or run like a rabbit the moment he could? Brun had been fond of the red-headed maid. They had been courting, or near enough. Her death was not something he was taking lightly. Angharad looked away, ashamed that she had nothing to say. Neither of the Cherduns had covered themselves with glory on the dominion of lost things. I hate that you must have that look on your face because of them, Brun quietly said. I don't know what you are, Angharad Tredegar, but no Infanzon is it. They will use you until you break, the same they do everything else, and after they'll not shed a tear. It's just what they are. There is more to them than that, Angharad said. Maybe, Brun said. Sometimes one man out of 1,000 does get rich riffling through the dung heap, it's true. But even then, Angharad, all the rest just got shit on their hands. The phrasing was crude, but she understood the meaning. He was not going to take on the chance on either Raymond or Isabel after what he had seen of them. It was, much as she disliked admitting it, entirely understandable. and it was not Brun's duty to convince himself of the worth of the nobles ruling over him. If the sheep sought the shepherd's crook, there would be no need for it, the High Queen had once said. "I understand," she said. "I wish it were otherwise, but what is that save noise?" Brun worried his lip. "I owe you for the way you drew the cultists off us," the Sacramontan said. "I haven't forgotten that." "I did not do it for reward," Angharad dismissed. "We were companions, fighting to keep us alive is nothing more than what was owed." He looked frustrated, for reasons she did not understand. "I don't think the diving crews will stay the same," Brun told her. "We can talk again after a day or two, see if there's something to be done." She smiled, appreciating the intention more than a prospect she doubted would ever come to pass. "I will still see you at camp," Angharad told him. "We need not be strangers." "No," he muttered. "I suppose not." "Then take care of yourself, Brun," she said. "Perhaps the third trial will bring us side by side again." He jerked a nod, looking embarrassed. "I'll keep an eye out for you," the Sacramontan promised. "See you around, Lady Tredegar." They parted ways with an undertone that was almost bittersweet. Angharad had spent only a few days with the companions she made on the Blue Belt, but the ties felt older than that. Thicker. She began to understand why it was that Mother said a captain who fought with her men need never fear mutiny. Facing death together was no small thing. Working away as the blond man returned to his work, Angharad breathed out. Her crew lacked strength, she saw it plain. Brun had made his decision plain, and she would not disrespect him by trying to convince him otherwise, which now left one name at the top of her list. Song was cleaning her musket when the Perduri approached her, carefully checking every part under lantern light. "May I sit?" Angharad asked. "There is no need," Song replied without looking away from her weapon. Angharad felt a sting of betrayal at the other woman's words, however undeserved. "Two more fighters," the Tianxi continued. "If you want me to come along, that is what you need to secure. Anything less is throwing our lives away." She let out a breath of relief. Not a sundering of their relationship, then, but a requirement she could only call reasonable. Song owed none of their crew anything, certainly not her life. "Will you desist from accepting other offers until then?" she asked. "I will not go with Tupac Sickle," Song said, tearing away her gaze from the musket only to look past her. "Anything else I will consider, waste no time, Angharad. The competition is not dallying." She turned to follow where the Tianxi was looking, seeing Lord Ishan and Shalini Gol conversing with Lady Ferranda. Angharad pushed down her dismay. She had not thought Ferranda would be poached so quickly, half hoping that after gathering more strength she could talk the other noble into coming with them despite her distrust of the other in fanzones. By the way the blonde in fanzona was nodding at the words of the other two, she would not have that opportunity. Teeth clenched, her gaze swept the courtyard for other possibilities. Tupac was talking with the married pair, who displayed hesitant looks. Even the desperate knew better. Yang was speaking with Tristan and the toothless old professor. She was not sure the latter two would qualify as fighters in Song's eyes, so she pushed that talk further down the ladder. Of those fit to fight, a pair did stand alone, Lady Inyani and her nephew Lord Zenzel. Angharad grimaced. She had avoided the Milani pair because of the man's strange behavior, thinking they might be assassins, but they had paid her no attention since the Blue Bell docked. It seemed her suspicions had done them disservice. They were standing by the great iron gate, talking quietly as they beheld it, and Angharad made to join them. "Ursine, it's like before," Lord Zenzel was saying. "It must be some kind of stone from the far south." Her arrival was caught by the elder of the two. Lady Angharad, Inyani half turned to greet her. "Lady Inyani," she returned, then nodded at the nephew. "Lord Zenzel." The grizzled older woman snorted. "My sister's the one who got the title," she said. "There is no need to spare me one as well, Tredegar." "Then you may take it as a mark of respect instead," Angharad replied. The older woman blinked in surprise. Her nephew seemed amused, though only shallowly. His eyes were as watchful of her now as when they had been on the ship. "We've not much had the pleasure of your company, Lady Angharad, so forgive her for not knowing of your respect," Zenzel Riley said. "Are you come to join in our wonder at this strange stone?" She did not answer the unspoken reproach, for she had no good answer to it, and instead followed the other man's invitation. Though the grand iron gate, not a simple slab of metal but a mass of intricate gears and mechanisms, was set into the massive pillar, the side and hinges were covered with a fine border and another kind of stone. It was deep blue, not unlike lapis in color, but a simple rap of her knuckles confirmed her suspicion. It was soft stone, a kind she did know. "This is Severi marble," she told them. "Polished." Lord Zenzel eyed her dubiously. "You seem very sure of that," he said. "I had a piece in my bedchamber mere months ago," Angharada Musadli told him. "A gift from my mother." Distaste flickered across the Mullaney's face. "Of course you did," he scorned. "At least try a more believable lie, Tredegar. Who is your mother, then, Her Perpetual Majesty or Captain Marrere? The Crown has a monopoly on Severi marble and only Marrere ships may carry it. Every lord in Malin knows that, though perhaps word did not reach as far as Parader." She met his scorn with a black stare. "My mother's name was Rhiannon Tredegar," she replied, though like all peers of Parader she did have to register a Mullaney name on the rolls, Lady Sazani Marrere. She leaned forward. "As for the piece of marble I refer to, it was the first ever dug up in Severi after the colony was founded," she coldly continued. "The High Queen was presented the second, you see, for its blue was deeper and it had a beautiful crack of gold going through it." Zenzel swallowed loudly. There was a long, awkward silence, then Ingeni let out a snort. "Well, you had that one coming," the grizzled woman said. "You'll have to forgive my nephew, Lady Tredegar, grief has addled his mood." At the reminder that the young woman with them was taken by the cultists, her expression sobered. "I was very sorry to hear what happened to Ayanda," she quietly said. "We don't know that she's dead," Zenzel said. He sounded like a man trying to convince himself. "Pray to the sleeping god that she is," Lady Ingeni flatly replied. "It is the kindest of the fates before her." The Mullaney clenched his fists. "If Ishan has just agreed to pursue them, then we may well have lost more than one," Ingeni sharply interrupted. "Or died at the bridge because he had already overused his contract." "You don't know that," Zenzel insisted. "And we'll never know, because they fucking refused to try to rescue the reason I came to this fucking island in the first place." His voice was halfway to a shout by the end of the sentence and he was panting. Angharade did not need to look to know they were drawing attention, but she could not bring herself to feel embarrassed, not looking at the raw grief on his face. It would been too petty. Ingeni sighed, then turned an eye on her. "I can guess at why you came to us, Lady Tredegar," she said. "As you can see, we will not be making common cause with Ishan Nair again." "I did seek you out to make alliance," Angharade admitted, "but such talk can wait. I have disturbed you in your grief." Zenzel scoffed, though the anger did not feel directed at her. "I'll still be grieving her in 50 years, Tredegar. What difference could a few hours possibly make? Out with it." His bluntness bordered on rudeness, but patience came easy when she saw the look in his eyes. Much could be forgiven of a man when he had a knife in the belly. "Crews are forming to delve into the maze," Angharade said, matching frankness with frankness. "I would have the two of you in mine." Ingeni grunted, eyes considering. "You've got the Ruesta dead weight and her maid, also dead weight, then the younger Cherden. Any truth to him having a contract?" Angharade hesitated, then nodded. It was nothing they could not learn by asking around. "Slightly better," Ingeni conceded. "Cosm's no slouch, but it's not us he'll be keeping an eye out for. Your roster is not his strong cell. Did you get that pretty blonde boy or the Tianxi with the trick shots?" "Song will join if you do," Angharade said. She could have turned a phrase to hide the detail, but why bother? It had been tiring, the game of twists and turns with the Cherdens, and she would gladly be rid of it. Best not to weave rope now she might later hang herself with. Ingeni met her nephew's eyes, cocking an eyebrow, and Angharade knew her to be amenable. She would be, since they could not join the diving crew forming around Lord Ishan, and the other rising prospect was Tupac. It was Lord Zenzel that looked unconvinced. "You spent the entire trip to the island avoiding us," Zenzel said. What has changed? There she drew a line. Did you seek me out any more than I sought you? She evenly asked. He conceded that with a grunt. I broke a betrothal to come here, Lord Zenzel abruptly said. With a house of no small means and a famously vengeful disposition, keeping away from anyone come of the Isles seemed safer. On the ship, she recalled, his eyes had always been moving, seeking out dark corners. It was why she'd thought he might be an assassin in the first place, and now the realization that he had been looking for the same knives she thought him to bear startled a laugh out of her. Zenzel's face moved through surprise and then anger. I know not what. I am the last of my house, save for my uncle and the watch. Angharade cut through. I fled to Sacramonte pursued by assassins. She had not seen father or her cousins die with her own eyes, but there could be no doubt. The man's face turned incredulous. You saw we were from Milan, and you thought? Yes, Angharade admitted. And we thought? Yes, Angharade repeated. A moment passed, then Lord Zenzel let out a bitter chuckle. Sleeping god, that's fucked, he admitted. Funny, in a horrible sort way. His aunt put a hand on his shoulder. We can band together, Inyani said. But something must be made clear, we do not take orders from you, and certainly not from the Infanzones. This is alliance, not servitude. I would not ask otherwise, Angharade told her. It is all I have pledged. Good, Lady Inyani said, then glanced at her nephew. Zenzel let out a long breath, then nodded. We can deal, he said. If we had earlier, then. He grimaced. I could dig for a year and still find further mistakes were made, the Milani said. I will spare you the talk, Lady Tredegar. We will go fetch our packs and set them beside yours. As plain a statement about who they stood with as Angharade might ask for. It ought to be enough to convince Song, whose presence would turn their crew into a respectable force. The noblewoman nodded her thanks at the pair, watching as they left, speaking in low voices. She allowed some of the tension to bleed out of her now that they were no longer looking. Already her crew numbered 8, nearly a third of those who had made it to the Trial of Ruins, but she still felt vulnerable. She stood there before the great iron gate, resisting the urge to fiddle with the buttons of her new vest as she wondered whether she should still be recruiting. Soft footsteps on the stone had her glancing back, finding a familiar tricorn and crow's nest. Tristan's black eye was now a vivid purple, but the swelling had gotten better. As had the rest of him, not only had he clearly taken a bath, but his most ragged clothes had been replaced. He now wore a black cloth kirtle over loose trousers tucked into a new pair of boots, the physician evidently having availed himself of the watch's stocks. There was even a pistol tucked into his belt, though Angharade could not ever remember seeing him fire a shot. Though they had not parted on good terms and only reunited with complicating nuances, the gray-eyed man did not seem unfriendly. As he idly came to stand by her, facing the iron gate as well, Angharade came to suspect she was the only one feeling uncomfortable. It made her uneasy, to not know where the two of them stood. She had accused him, perhaps unjustly, and done so for reasons that now shamed her. Yet he did not seem to be keeping a grudge, and had seen to her wounds when they encountered each other on the stairs to Sanctuary. Much as it embarrassed her to revisit their conflict, Angharade knew it would be the only way to clear the air. Best to get it over with. I was wrong to accuse you after the twin died, Angharade evenly said. It was not an apology. She would not apologize for thinking he might have been involved when he had beaten the woman killed but a day before, but neither would she shy away from the fact that she had accused him for the wrong reasons. Feeling cheated by the good impression he had made on her and how harshly it had been revealed to be wrong was not an honorable reason to accuse him. She had been heeding the sting of her pride, not truly attempting to find out whether he had killed the Tianxi. I was the natural suspect, Tristan acknowledged. I imagine that's half the reasons they aimed for John in the first place. Angharade shifted her footing, yet uneasy. It did not feel like anything had been resolved. I no longer believed you to have had a hand in it, whatever that is worth to you, she offered. That, at least, one reaction. Tupaxical, is it? The Sacramontan asked with half a smile. He was already scheming to offer us to the cultists, Angharade said. It seems consistent for him to have sown the seeds of us going our own way. Our company came to the same conclusion while we ran, Tristan told her. And yet now I wonder. She started in surprise. It was only a matter of time until we split up. Anyhow, the Sacramontan continued, so what did Sickle truly gain? He was most ardent in pushing fault towards you, Angharade pointed out. Not an uncommon thing for men to do when trying to avoid paying for their crimes. I'll not deny he leapt at the opportunity to stir the pot, he conceded. But why do it when complete surprise would have served him even better? We would not have become suspicious of him so soon if not for John's death. If not him, she asked, then who? Tristan smiled at her, though it did not reach those grey eyes. I do not know, Lady Angharade, he said. And that worries me more than the thought of some gods in a maze, because those will not follow us past the old fort's walls. The noblewoman was not convinced, but neither would she dismiss his suspicions out of hand. That he would be so caught up chasing shadows when he was said to have been fearless in front of a great monster like an Aravetan was just one more confusing contradiction. She looked away, gaze going back to the iron gate. Some of the people here are easy to place, Angharade finally said. You, however, have been a discomforting man to try to fit anywhere. He cocked an eyebrow. I thank you for the compliment. It had been no such thing, they both knew. What did you do, Tristan, if I may ask? She pressed. I thought you a physician's apprentice, but Ferranda calls you courageous and you wield a dead collector's weapon as well as a knife. I've never met someone who fit in a box without some parts first getting chopped off, Lady Angharade, Tristan mildly replied. As for my occupation, I did whatever would keep me fed that month. Some parts of that were pleasanter than others, as were the lessons the world doled out. Seeing her unconvinced expression, he sighed. Some of those months were spent serving as a cutter's attendant, Tristan said. I have been a messenger boy, a dealer in stolen goods, a smuggler and a dozen other things that were never so neat as to be called a trade. A criminal, Angharade thought as her lips thinned. She had begun to suspect as much, but it would have been a grave insult to assume. If this had been Peredur, if he had made the choice to break the law when there was a peer ruling over him and providing the opportunity of honest work, she would have held him in contempt. Only he was of Sacramonte, that rotting hive of a city, and how much choice did the souls in the belly of that beast really have? Angharade did not think she was wrong to try to place people, but there was so much of the world that she had yet to see, to understand. If a man did not fit in a box, she thought, the fault lay with the box and not the man. Did that ease your mind any? He asked. He sounded curious. The contrary, I think, Angharade murmured. But that might be for the best. To learn without discomfort was to fish only in shallow waters. She swallowed, dry-mouthed, then spoke impulsively. You could join us, she said. In the maze, I mean. Grey eyes considered her. I do not intend to venture out, Tristan said. Not for now, at least. She was not sure whether she was relieved or disappointed. You have done more fighting than most, Angharade allowed. Rest was earned. That's not why I want to stay here, he smiled. See, I'm not convinced that Lieutenant Wen told us the truth. She blinked. About the maze? About this trial being anywhere as straightforward as the trial of lions, he said. He did not elaborate and she did not ask. Her path ahead was already set, and she could respect that the man had found his own even if she believed it would lead him nowhere. Tristan's eyes remained on the great iron gate, never straying. What is it about it that interests you so? Angharade asked. It is the maze that will take us across, not the gate. The man cocked his head to the side. Those mechanisms on the gate, the moving parts, he said. What would you say they look like? Angharade blinked in surprise, then took her first careful look at it all. The iron gate must be 50 feet tall and about half as large, but it felt heavier for all the machinery it was laden with, cogs and gears and bands of metal, plaques fitted like a grid, and so many pistons and interlocked pieces it was hard to tell where the mechanisms began or ended. She had seen some drawn schematics of First Empire wonders, As a girl, the famous towers of the Tower Coast, Eastleigh candles and even the broken gate before the Triglav broke it, and the resemblance was striking. "A lot," she finally said. "I thought that too, at first," Tristan said. "Not anymore?" "Not anymore, no," he agreed. The gray-eyed man smiled. "Right now, I'd say they look like clockwork." Chapter 21. Angharad Tredegar walked away, leaving him to stand alone before the gate, and Tristan smiled. That had worked out better than he'd hoped it might. The invitation to join her crew had come as a surprise to him, and to her as well, he suspected, but it told him his instincts had been correct. Tredegar liked for people to be good and bad, with little room in between, so now that he was not strictly bad, her opinion of him was leaning the other way. "That was nice of you," Fortuna mused, chin resting on his shoulder as she held him tight. A pause. "So why did you actually do it?" Tristan only kept smiling. That business with the Erevatin had improved his reputation markedly, but while that may have some uses, it also meant that his reputation was now worth something. It could therefore be used as leverage against him. So before Tupac Sickle came knocking with a smile and a threat to tell everyone that his medicine cabinet was truly a poisoner's arsenal, it was best to cut the grass under the Eastleigh's feet. Tredegar hated the man, and was now likely to side with Tristan if he gave a halfway believable lie as answer, which would do away with most the damages. Ferranda Vilazar would keep her mouth shut about the lodestone extract. They had an understanding, and even if the remaining infanzones wanted to make something it they could not. Augusto was a muzzled dog, unable to do anything without his master's permission, and the other two had to toe Angharad Tredegar's line now. The mirror dancer might not have noticed it, but without her Raymond Sheridan and Isabel Ruesta were fairly fucked. Precious few people wanted to do anything with the Sheridan now that word had got around about one stabbing his own valet in the back, and Isabel Ruesta was all but useless in a fight. "Don't you know I love making friends?" he lied. Fortuna pressed her lips against the side of his neck and blew a staggeringly unpleasant raspberry in retaliation, which had him squirming enough he got a strange look from Inyoni. Fleeing the scene as the lady of long odds laughter echoed behind him, he dipped by the kitchen table to help himself to one of the comforts the watch had set out, a large steaming pot of what, by the smell, must be dandelion tea. He claimed a mug, thanked the watchman watching over the pot, and proceeded to the next part of his plan. Finding a comfortable nook to sit in with his warm drink. There he sat in silence, eyes unblinking, and began drawing a map. Not one of the maze, though in time there might be a need for that, but of something rather more important, crews. The nature of mankind was that if you dropped 30 strangers into a pit with nothing but the clothes on their back, within an hour there would be 5 factions, and 2 of those would be looking for knives to pull on each other. It was simply how people were, no matter where they were born. Now the souls on display here were from all over Vesper, and the lives that had led them to this courtyard seemed just as disparate, so where they would fall was not easy to predict. This was not a curse, however, but a boon. Looking at where people felt, Tristan would be able to get some notion of what they actually wanted. Take O'Cotlin, for example. The large Aslan legbreaker was sticking to Tupac Sickle and did not look like he'd ever considered otherwise, even though he would be welcome in other crews. That was because O'Cotlin most wanted to be on the same side of the beatings he was used to, namely, the one doling them out. The only one sure to deliver on that was Tupac, who had all the restraint of the animal emblem of his former society. Now contrast the men Hermano Bruiser to the other survivor from Tupac's crew, Lady Acanthifos. Arguably the keystone of the Eastleigh's strategy in the trial of lines with her tracking contract. She now avoided getting anywhere near Tupac, talking with the Remiant pair like someone tried to get in. That was because Acanthifos cared most about safety. She'd been fine with Tupac selling the rest of the Bluebell out if it made it any more likely for her to get to the second trial. But Tredegar has said he'd sold out one of their own, Leander Galatas, the sailor who'd lost his arm on the ship. In her eyes, Tupac had turned from someone dangerous to others into a man dangerous to everyone, including his own crew. So she was abandoning ship, and with Angharad Tredegar more likely to stab her than take her in, the best bet for safety was the Remians. Ishanner and Shalini Gol had already got their hands on Fiandavilazar, an auspicious start. Whether or not people realized it yet, they had begun to divide along the lines that Lieutenant Wen had implied, 3 shrines matched by 3 diving crews. Oh, for now it was more like half a dozen, but Tristan had seen this sort of thing at work in the murk. Small coteries, gangs, were fiercely independent when their corner of the mud went undisturbed, guarding their little kingdoms jealously, but that died the moment the bigger dogs came. When the Hoyaruya poked a nosing, all the petty kings swore brotherhood with the rivals they'd tried to kill a month ago and began talking about sticking together in the face of encroachment. It was the same here, in a sense. The maze would do the work of convincing the smaller crews to let the larger ones eat them, until only a handful of forces broadly in the same league were left standing. Even if the knowledge of the horrors out there did not turn out to be enough today, then tomorrow the balance would tip, once bodies began dropping. That strange sickness called tolerance for your fellow men had a way of spreading around. Tristan couldn't be sure, not yet, but after watching for about half an hour he believed he'd figured out the 3 kingdoms that would end up the victors. "So, what are we looking at?" Fortuna asked. She sat above him to his left, in a broken cleft of stone, the blood-red dress tripped down to the dusty floor, long past her feet, as she rested her chin on the palm of her hand. She looked bored at a glance, but Tristan knew better. She had always liked watching people, especially interesting sorts, and many here qualified for the word in her eyes. He smiled and hid his mouth behind the rim of his cup. "If we're naming crowns, Tredegar is the easy one," he said. "She'll end up with the largest crew too, mark my words." Not that she had made it easy on herself. Given her record on the Blue Belt and the rumors now going around that she had single-handedly cut through a cultist war band before fighting Tupac Sickle to a draw, there was not a single individual here who would turn down an alliance with her. Not even Tristan himself, had he intended to delve the maze. "She looks a little harried," Fortuna observed. "That's because the leeches put her in charge," he said. Not that they had a choice. Tredegar's trouble was that she had inherited a pack of parasites from the first trial, Isabel Ruesta, the smarter of the Sheridan brothers in Cosmoflor. Though not Beatrice, whose absence was glaring. Still, that early inheritance had raised Tredegar's numbers from the start, but come at a cost in that everyone not a fool knew the Infanzones would sacrifice them without hesitation if it kept them alive even a minute longer. Not the kind of company you wanted to keep in a maze full of deadly tests. Even in the face of that, though, Tredegar was picking up recruits. First came Inyani and Zenzel Duma, the survivors of the Mulaney threesome from the Blue Bell. Lord Zenzel had been looking all this time like he was either about to weep or bite someone's head off, not the stuff solid allies were made of, and both he and his aunt were avoiding the reminds they'd come with, though not your Etsy, the quiet Estlan who once again glided through peril without drawing attention. Tredegar was the only safe port of call for the Mulaney, so she had hooked them without much trouble. With that many fighters on her side, she would now be able to pick up another member or two without nearly as much difficulty. The more there were under Tredegar, the less the Infanzones were a millstone around her neck. Tupac's want 2, Fortuna decided. He has already got 2. Tristan drank, then hid his lips again. His will be the weakest, the thief said. He keeps O'Cutlan and Augusto Cherton has nowhere else to go, but it is only the desperate he will draw. His reputation was too blackened for anything else, no matter how skilled the man was at fighting. People going to Tupac would know they'd be treated as expendable, so those who went anyway would do so for lack of a better crew to fall in with. Tristan suspected that Angharate Tredegar might well accept every fearful soul pleading to hide in her shadow, but her comrades would not be as accommodating. They would not tolerate useless hanger-ons trailing them in the maze while they faced all the perils. He's getting Felis and Ains, at the very least, Tristan said. Perhaps Francho as well. He would have said as much even if the Pale-Eyed were not currently speaking to Felis, whose shoulders were hunched even though he was the one being sought out. It's the reminds that intrigue, he continued. Their position is the most interesting. Lord Ishanner and his right hand, Shalini Gol, who was visibly the most assertive of the two but still deferred to the nobler of the pair, were in the right spot to have some ripe fruits fall straight into their lap. Anyone who did not want to work with the infanzones but could not stomach Tupac Sickle. They'd marked themselves as that option by recruiting Fear and Vilazar bright and early, forming a neat bundle of firepower and competence that everyone must eye with consideration. On the other hand, they'd failed to retain a single comrade from the first trial. The Mulaney survivors pointedly avoided them, and Etsy had made herself scarce despite what Tristan believed to have been an attempt by Shalini to rope her in. There was a mistake buried somewhere in their wake, and if the thief had to bet, he'd say it had to do with the missing Mulaney. Ayanda, had it been? Tredegar had mentioned the Red Eye cult taking her with Tupac's help, but there must have been more to it than that. Considering how unmoored Zenzalduma acted and how closely he and Ayanda had kept together on the Blue Belt, the thief had some suspicions about where things might have gone wrong. It also told him that Inyani's nephew had cared more about Ayanda than about passing these trials. That might end up useful to know, before everything was over. They are picking up foes, Fortuna replied with open distaste. That seems more desperate than interesting. No, it is very clever, Tristan disagreed. It's not about if she is useful now, it is about opening a door. For other traitors? The goddess asked. The big man won't drop Tupac, and they wouldn't want the rest. It is about the precedent, the thief said. Akanthi foes acted against others, treacherously so, but she was still taken in. So they're forgiving, Fortuna shrugged. Oh yes, Tristan murmured behind the cup. And when tomorrow or the day after someone in Tredegar's group cuts an ally's throat to live and flees our honorable friend's company, there is another home for them aside from Tupac Sickle's collections of bastards and sacrifices. Even if all Akanthi foes ended up being was a warm body with a sword when they walked the maze, her real value was in what her presence represented. The thief suspected he would enjoy conversation with whichever of the Ramayans had come up with a scheme. A shame that even when he ventured out it would not be with their crew, as the men he intended to kill were among Tupac and Tredegar's followers. Draining the last of his dandelion tea, long gone from lukewarm to cold, Tristan set down the cup. Fortuna gracefully leapt down from her perch, dress trailing behind her as she adroitly came to stand before him. So, who are we joining? Fortuna cheerfully asked. Tristan rolled his neck, getting up with a sigh. First, he said, we begin by rigging the dice. And it meant dealing with a fellow rat. Smile, Tristan suggested. We are having a pleasant conversation. Lan beamed at him, tugging at her gray tunic as she tittered. What is it you've come to sell me, rat? The dealer smilingly asked. I want us to run a game, the thief replied just as smilingly. She laughed, lightly slapping his arm like he'd just told a joke. Tristan rather admired the work. It had taken him years to learn to laugh at will, and he still didn't look anywhere as convincing as the former Meng Xiao Fein frontwoman. Who on? Everyone, he said. This maze is meant to keep us looking forward. It splits us up so one can have a good look at the whole and figure out what this show's really about. Yes, Lan impatiently said. Obviously. You think I don't know a front when I see one? The watch is better trained at keeping secrets with knives than tricks. It was Lan read in a sentence that her talent for seeing through things was just a little more useful than it was worrying. We split up across the crews, he said. And share information back at the fort, she mused. It was hard to read what she thought of it, as Lan then let out a chuckle like they were having fun. You're going to get Young in under the Ramayans, the blue-lipped woman decided. He's the best fit. So you want me to join up with Tupac? You won't be alone, he's taking Phyllis and Ains, Tristan pointed out. Fear's a fine leash but it won't beat your supply of dust. I don't need you to use it, Tristan, Lan said. And you'd be taking the nice cushy job by going with Tredegar. He shook his head. I won't go with them, he said. I mean to trade with Beatrice for that. Lam's brow rose. I have not seen her since I got here, she said. Not even for meals. I'll find her, Tristan shrugged. It was not so large a fort he would struggle to if he put his mind to it. Lan studied him for a moment, then let out a low whistle. "So it's the watch you're thinking of spying on," she said, looking him up and down. "Look at the balls on you." He did not deny it, which killed any talk of him taking the lesser risk. In truth, for all that she was posturing, Lan was short on choices. She had no in with Tredegar's crowd and was not useful enough for Ferrand of Elazar to vouch for her and get her under the Remains. Her way out would be tying herself to someone who was useful and coming as a package deal, but that would be tricky to manage and she had no obvious candidate. She might well end up stuck with Tupac anyway, they both knew, and without the benefits of having accepted the terms he was offering. "I want protection from everyone that's brought into this," Lan finally said. "It could turn sour on me." Tristan nodded. "Then you must offer the same," he said. A symbolic gesture if it came to a brawl, but that was not where Lan's strengths lay. She nodded back, then brightly smiled. "Now we need to sell it," she said. "You demanded a fuck in exchange for protection?" It was, he thought, telling that she would suggest that first. The Meng Xiao Feng did not deal in flesh peddling, but that was business. Inside the coteries' own ranks, the sisters had been twins, too. That would draw some sorts. He let no pity touch his gaze, for there was none of that to be had under the law of rats. It was for finer folk than they to extend the boundary of victory beyond survival. "I don't," he simply said. She did not comment aside from a blink of surprise. He considered for a moment. "You asked for the relic pistol back, now that I have another weapon," he said. "I refused." "Do you even have the scraps left?" she asked. He shrugged. He did not. He'd thrown the useless weight away, but what did it matter? Even if someone thought to sneak into his pack and look, she could simply say she had not believed him. After a moment she nodded, conceding to the unspoken answer. They both shifted their footing, turning to face each other properly, and mirth was replaced on her face by black anger. She slapped him, hard enough the sound carried, and said something that sounded like she died for it before striding away angrily. Ignoring the many eyes now on him, Tristan cradled his stinging cheek and sighed. She'd put her back into the slap knowing he'd have to let her away with it. He first busied himself returning his cup to the makeshift kitchen, keeping an eye out for the people he needed to have a talk with now. Young was not hard to find, and looked rather amused when their gazes met, but there was no sign of Sare. A few others were missing as well, gone to talk or rest out of sight, Etsy, Brun, Song, and Beatrice, of who there was still no sign. That was beginning to worry him. He went to sit by Young, who had claimed one of the tables around the kitchen to clean his musket and pistol. Given how many people were doing that, Tristan began to wonder if he should as well. "Should I ask what you did to deserve that?" the Tianxi asked. However sly the smile, it did not quite hide the slight slur to the words. "He's drunk." Too drunk for this conversation. Tristan decided not, after an appraising look. For now it was only slurring. The closest person to them was Raymond Cherden, who was at a table on the other side of the kitchen and eyeing Tredegar, speaking animatedly with Zenzel Duma and Isabel Ruesta. The look on his face was somewhere between hate and desire, both dark enough that Tristan shivered in disgust. Still, the two of them should be safe to talk without being overheard. "The same thing I am about to ask you," the thief replied. "Have you given thought to which crew you want?" "We agreed to stick together for the second trial," Young evenly said. "I have had offers but accepted nothing." "Is Han there?" Tristan asked. "Gold did the talking for them," the former soldier replied. "Xikal tried as well, but he can burn." "You should take Shalini's offer," the thief said. Young stared at him a long moment, frowning. The drink slowed his thoughts some but not all the way. "Me," he slowly said, "but not you. Are you ending our alliance?" Surprise, Tristan thought, and perhaps a hint of hurt. He shook his head. "No," he murmured. "See, Lan took my offer. She slapped me so, Xikal wouldn't think twice about taking her in," Young muttered, now caught on. "You're trying to plant spies in the diving crews." His eyes narrowed. "Or saboteurs." "No point in that," Tristan dismissed. "There's something off about this trial, Young. And I do not think that going into that maze like good little soldiers is going to help us find out what's really going on." At least not if that's all we do. That is dangerous talk, the veteran warned. You think the rooks will just let you sniff around? I think that there's a telescope set up on one of the bastions, with more astronomy equipment, Tristan replied. And that not knowing why is more likely to get me killed than trying to find out. Young hesitated. I need to get to the third trial, he finally said. Tristan breathed in sharply. It was not quite a refusal, but close enough. He would have liked to say that it surprised, that he had not been sloppy enough to expect agreement, but it would be a lie. And it was unfair to do this when the man had drunk, but when if not now? Why did they send you here, Young? Tristan asked. What do they have on you? The Tianxi's face closed and his hand twitched, like he wanted to reach for his flask but he'd stopped himself. Only the aborted gesture wasn't an answer, not really. You like a drink, Tristan acknowledged, but if it had eaten you alive you wouldn't be able to fight like you do, or shoot, or run. Did you kill someone? That is not a small question, Yang said. It was not, and Rats paid up front. I did, Tristan admitted. Someone on contract for the Hoyoroya, a watch deserter. I didn't set out to, but it happened, and after that it was either the Dominion or getting my hands chopped off before they hung me upside down. Rios Lorando, they called it. The Weeping Rivers. It didn't take too long to die, not like some of the other ways coteries killed you, but they would hang you from up high so the red got everywhere. It was impossible to miss, which was what the Hoya cared most about, making an example. Reminding everyone that raising hands against them would cost the hands, and then see you spill out everything inside you until there was nothing left at all. Young breathed in deeply, then rested a hand on the back of his head. Cursing in Cathayan, he reached for the inside of his coat and got his flask out. His fingers trembled as he undid the cork, taking a long swallow. I am surprised there is any left, Tristan frankly said. It did not smell like Herbera, either, which had been all but finished anyhow. I brought 3, the Tianxi said. The thief cocked an eyebrow. He'd seen the man drink often and smelled it even more frequently on his breath. And bought refills in their garrison roadgut, Young admitted. The touch of levity was too light to really do more than skitter at the edge of their mood. Young took his time, almost beginning to talk several times before closing his mouth. He drank twice more. Before leaving Cation, he said, I stabbed a general 5 times. Tristan choked. He had not been sure what to expect, but it had not been that. I'd won decorations after the killing fields at Daiakai, Young abruptly said. They sent us across the plain, Tristan, with the curl cannons reaping us like wheat. I wanted to run, like anyone else, but we were halfway through and I knew the cannons wouldn't stop firing just because we routed, so after a shot took off Old Rong's head, I picked up the standard and told them to keep moving forward. Yang set his hands on the table, fingers splayed against the wood, and glared down until they ceased shaking. And they trusted me, after our years together, so they did. General Key sent 4,000 men charging across the field to Daiakai, all Cation militia, he said. About half survived. The wings routed, but the sentry held and I was right in the middle of it. He let out a bleak, ugly laugh. My company had it worse because we didn't rout, Yang said. They turned the full batteries on us so we'd break, ignored the runners. He breathed out, slowly, as if he were forcing out a ghost. We never reached their lines, he said. The battle was over before that. We'd been a distraction, see. Meant to rout and draw the current regulars down the hills in pursuit so the mercenaries hidden in the woods could hit the left flank and flip their battle line. But you didn't rout, Tristan quietly said. And didn't end up mattering a fucking thing, Yang said with cold fury. The Karel cavalry was out sacking a village an hour away instead of watching the left flank, so when the mercenary captains saw there were no guards and the enemy was watching the plain they attacked without waiting for the signal, took them completely by surprise, routed the entire army right off the field. Oh, Tristan thought, for words failed him. The greatest victory against an imperial army in 30 years, the Tianxi said. General Key was the finest general in all the republics, they told us, the most brilliant military mind of her generation. So you killed her, the thief said. It took 2 years to get close enough, Young said. But she liked to keep us militiamen close because we'd been such an important part of her victory. Called us her bravest men, the backbone of Cation. She liked to promote us when she could, make a show of it and have a meal between just us veterans afterwards. The Tianxi grasped at the back of his head, avoiding the bun, as if he wanted to pull off hair. I wasn't planning to kill her, at first, he said. But every night I dreamt about that fucking charge, Tristan, and when I got promoted to Sima, Major, she recognized my name. This man, she said right in front of all those green boys, kids that had never even been anywhere in battle and didn't know she was lying. This man won me Daikai, she said. My grand plan would have come to nothing if not for the bravery of the Cation militia. Young smiled. So when we sat for dinner, after the servant set down the roast duck, I got up to carve it and shoved that knife right in her fucking throat, he said, almost dreamily. I kept stabbing until she stopped moving. Didn't think I'd get out alive, after, but no one went in the tent for half an hour and by then I'd already stolen a horse. He drank again, licking his lips after. I got to my zoo before the news did, he said. I'd ridden that horse to death, then stolen another. Immediately bought a berth on a ship to Tunic with the last of my coin. The former soldier met Tristan's eyes, smiling sadly. And the dreams they stopped, for a time, Young said. I did killing for bad men, enough to earn a decent living, and when some Cation folk came asking around about a deserter I bought passage to Sacramonte. I was smiling when I did, though, you know? Tunic had always felt too close, but on a ship to the city I felt free. But it didn't last, the thief said. I thought it wouldn't, deep down, but it did. I went clean in Sacramonte, Young told him. No more blade work, not even for the Guardia. I bounced around jobs at the docks for a bit until I found a genuine fixing tea shop in Old Town. I knew the brewing and the ceremonies, my grandmother was Sanxing stock, she taught me everything, and they felt that having someone born back in the old country added authenticity. And you kept your nose clean as a host in a tea shop? Tristan asked, almost skeptical. Young shrugged. Dusted off my sword once when the Meng Xiao Fein came sniffing around, trying to make us a storehouse for butterfly powder, but I didn't even need to use it, he smiled. It's where I met my husband. Pietro was mad for a white tea, came every week for a ceremony. He was younger than me, more than a decade, but neither of us cared. And things were good, they really were. It was, he thought, a pretty story. But Young was here now and so the thief already knew the end would not be. It was my sister-in-law that was the start of it, he said. A pause. It wasn't her fault, I don't mean to say that, Young continued. She'd borrowed some money from a lender when her husband broke his leg, to tide over until he got back to work, but when she returned to pay it was her the lender wanted. He invented some lie about the terms, said she had to pay with her body. She put him off and her husband beat the lender soundly when his leg got better. Knocked him out and left the coin owed. That should have been the end of it. But he had coterie friends, Tristan said, and it wasn't much of the guess. The coteries had their hands all over the moneylenders of Sacramonte, save those run by the Infanzones themselves. A brother, Young said. Some middling crew called the Mice Men. They sent 3 to break his other leg and told him if his wife didn't go to pay back the trouble next time they'd slit his throat. The thief winced. The smaller coteries were touchy about reputation, sometimes even more so than the real players. They knew they wouldn't get anywhere if people weren't afraid of them. Still, it was bold of these Mice Men to try such a thing outside the murk. The Guardia actually cared what happened in the Old Town. Not as much as the Orchard, where the Infanzones and the wealthy lived, but the Old Town made up most of Sacramonte's districts and the crucial section of the canals that were its lifeblood. The Red Cloaks did not hesitate to shut down coteries that made trouble in that part of the city. That was overstepping, Tristan said. The Guardia didn't get involved. They brought in the lender for a talk, but there was no proof and he bought his way out, Young said. Said he was being framed because we didn't want to pay what was owed. Those two were terrified the mice men would take revenge for snitching, and Pietro was the one who convinced them to tell the Red Cloaks, so he felt responsible. And you felt responsible for him, the thief said. That's what love is, Tristan, Young sadly smiled. Taking part. So I oiled my sword, cleaned my pistol and went to live with them for a few weeks. It was easy enough to tell what had followed. How many came? 4, the Tianxi said. The lender was with them. He paused. I shot him in the belly, Yang mused. Never did learn if he died from that. But his brother went wild after, so I had to kill him up close, sword to knife, and then another from behind when he tried to take a hostage. They ran after that, never came back. Yang drank. Until that night, I had not killed in over 10 years. And the dreams came back, Tristan softly said. I couldn't sleep a full night anymore, Yang murmured. Kept waking up screaming, charging across that fucking field at Dayaka with all my friends dying in general. Key right behind me smiling a skull's grin. Like she'd finally caught up. He pulled at the flask again, but it was empty. They warned me at the tea shop that I looked too tired, he said. It put people off. We tried everything, Tristan, but I only found one thing that let me sleep. The Tianxi stared down at the flask, then flicked a finger against it. It let out a tinny ring, empty for now. But not for long, Tristan thought. Started just before bed, Yang said. Like medicine. But it didn't stop there, and it got. Well, you don't need to know the details. We argued a lot. Pietro said I wasn't the man he had married. The former soldier grimaced. He wasn't wrong. They were already past the crest of the hill, Tristan thought. Down was the only way for this to go. Money wasn't great, Yang admitted. I got demoted to the back after smelling like rum before a ceremony, which paid less, and their family shop had to change suppliers after the old one died. Prices were higher, profits slimmer. He flicked a finger against the flask again, the sound like the ringing of a bell. We had to borrow to keep the house. We were months behind in payments, the Tianxi said. I took care of it. The Hoyoruya needed a man dead and I did the killing, so they lent us without interest. Of course they did, Tristan thought. You're everything they want in an enforcer. You need them more than the other way around. You have plain weaknesses and you're a trained soldier. They would have kept handing him rope again and again, waiting patiently until the leash came from it they would be able to pull. Even drunk, the road got deep in him now. Yang saw that thought plainly writ on his face. They were looking to bring me in, I think, he admitted, then looked away. I'm not sure I was going to refuse, not that it ever got to that. And now the ugly end. Yang's dark eyes were fervent when they returned to him. I don't blame him, I want you to understand that, he said. I'm 43, Tristan. He's only 30, he still has years ahead of him. So I don't blame him for taking the money and running. Tristan's heart clenched. But it was the Hoya's money, he quietly said. But it was the Hoya's money, Yang quietly agreed. What came out of the Tianxi's throat could not be considered a laugh, it was just a convulsion barren of joy. They found him in 3 days, Yang said. Of course they did. What does he know about hiding? And then they told me they'd forgive the whole thing, if I put the shot in his head myself. Water under the bridge. You didn't, Tristan said. And there was much of that story that he had never believed a man like Yang might do, but that much he did not doubt. I love him, Yang smiled. How could I? So instead I made them a deal. And suddenly it made sense. That's your red game, Tristan sharply breathed in. If you get to the 3rd trial, they write off the money. They spare him. The other man toasted him with an empty flask. So I have to get there, Tristan, he said. Whatever it might cost me, or anyone else, I will reach the trial of weeds. I owe my husband that much. You owe him nothing, the thief thought. He ran, and that makes him one of my lot. There can be nothing owed under the law of rats. I understand, he said instead. No, Yang said, I don't think you do. He grimaced. I'll help, he said, because it could be what I need. I'll go with the Ramayans, who I like most as a choice anyhow. But the moment this plan of yours looks as if it might keep me away from the third trial. You turn on me, Tristan completed. You tell them everything. Who them was did not matter. It could be the watch, it could be the remains or treasure of even Tupac sickle. It would be whatever kept Young safe so he would reach the trial of weeds, nothing more or less. It was a bittersweet thing, that in the same moment he came to understand the kind of man Young was, Tristan would come to understand that there was a limit to how far they could share trust. But having said this at all, the thief thought, was a kind of gift. Even if the Tianxi was drunk. Because he had not held back the secrets but instead given them out as a warning, so that Tristan might not overstep so much that betrayal must ensue. I'm sorry, Young quietly said, the slur thickening the words. But it is what it is. Tristan straightened his back. Don't be, he said. You promise all that you are free to promise. Asking anything more of you would be greed. And he meant it, he did, but looking at the pathetic gratitude in Young's eyes, what the drink was making of a man he respected, he had to look away. The bottle killed as many as sickness, down in the murk. In some ways it was one. There was a reason Tristan never drank unless forced. We'll talk before you leave, the thief said. Young snorted, then waved him away. Go, he said. It won't get any prettier. Tristan did not know what he would have answered, but he bit down on it anyhow. It was not his place to speak down to a man decades his senior, one who had lived through horrors he could not begin to imagine. Besides, that was one thing the bottle shared with sickness. Once it was in your bones, it was not for you to decide when it left. Some got through it, got out, but most got ridden all the way down into the grave. Tristan left with everything he'd come to get, but somehow it did not feel like a victory at all.